Okay, this is the fourth lecture, and we're going to pick things up a little bit here because we have a philosopher that I came in contact with in college through pamphlets, and so this is someone I really enjoy, and I hope that that you'll get something out of this lecture. I'm going to talk about Herbert Marcuse. Again, like Sartre, we're talking about an intellectual who becomes a pop cultural figure. I mean, this is a very rare thing for a German philosopher to have their picture on the cover of Life magazine, but this happens with Herbert Marcuse in the 60s. The reason it does, and this time I will go into the theory. In the case of Sartre, there's so many periods and stuff to follow out that's difficult. But with Marcuse, there are a series of guiding themes that we can follow that I think will explain why Marcuse was the philosopher of the 1960s. And I also want to explain that it's more than that Marcuse also caught a certain contradiction or crisis that was always in the heart of modernity, if you like that phrase, of modern life, of the world after capitalism, of the world after rationalization, you know, after bureaucratization, after you have bureaucracies and rational decision procedures everywhere. Marcuse catches a certain contradiction here that I think is absolutely vital for us to understand. If we go back to the traditional intellectual's way of looking at it, the familiar phrase for the rise of the modern world is the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment wants to free the human mind from superstition and from dogma, from the adherence to prejudice. This is the goal of the Enlightenment, beautifully stated by Kant in his essay, What is Enlightenment? When Kant says, dare to use your own reason, which already, you know, tells you that church fathers and things like that aren't, you know, don't listen to them, dare to use your own reason. Have the audacity to reason for yourself. Well, the Enlightenment's fueled by the rise of capitalism. It's fueled also by the rise and the incredible increase in the power of science and the ability of science to fuel technology, which has been my overall story I've been telling in all these lectures about the self under siege. One of the things we're buried under oceans of technologies and information systems and so on. Well, the crisis that was always in the heart of the Enlightenment, if you go back and look at it, the crisis that was always working on it was something like this. The attempt to demystify the world, the attempt to make the world, as it were, transparent to reason, carried with it a strange dark side always. And you may notice this when you watch television now. The more we, as it were, cleared the fields of the traditional religious views, the more that we became convinced that science, and one term for that Marcuse uses is instrumental reason. Reason used as an instrument for changing nature and human beings. The more that the Enlightenment project progressed, it simply turned out not to be the case that we became less afraid in the face of the unknown. No, the unknown appeared more terrifying than ever. And it wasn't the case that we became less dogmatic. As a matter of fact, the sciences have now branched out into so many areas that the only way anyone could believe in any of them is dogmatically, since none of us could study them because we don't have world enough or time. So in the paradoxical way, the Enlightenment builds up a kind of intellect intelligent enough to see through mystification. That's where I talked about Marx and Freud and other figures. We build up an intellect hard enough, as it were, to see through these mystifications. But any intellect that powerful has a tendency to become totalitarian. This is the fundamental problem. And nowhere would that be more evident than in the experience of the Germans, who were great at their technology, the advance in science, and so on. a world as instrumentally rational, you know, the famous joke that the trains run on time. But the flip side of enlightenment has been to sort of give up before the overpowering forces of technology in a more abject surrender than any that was ever called for in religion. I mean, to abjectly just to surrender before the powers of technology. And given the current state of the powers of technology, they far surpass the characteristics that we associate with God. I mean, think of it in this simple way. In the Bible, in the book of Revelations, the apocalypse is a magnificent myth, but long ago it became what in our society? A reality, a technologically achievable reality. What had been a myth became a technologically achievable reality. We no longer had to conjure up 10-headed beasts with 3 winged things to be afraid of. Now we had systems, rational systems, rational in quotes, instrumentally rational. That leads to a further paradox Marcuse locates in modern rationality. And that's that instrumental rationality. And I want to associate it with sort of atomic bits of what I've been calling information as opposed to knowledge, and instrumental singular decisions based upon them. You put these together and the outcome isn't rational. The outcome is irrational and dangerous. Let me give you an example. This is a very clear one. It's work's over, so it's time to go home. It's rational to want to go home after work. On my view of the good reading of Marxism, that's the most rational thing we want all day, is to get away from work. It's very rational. So each individual actor's decision to run out to their car and get on the freeway is rational. How about the outcome? Well, the outcome is that everybody's sitting on the freeway, breathing each other's smog, sitting on their butt. The outcome is irrational. The outcome of a whole... See, there was no reason. Because the Enlightenment focused upon reason as individuated, individual, atomic, they didn't see that the overall effects of reason working that way might themselves prove to be irrational. Another example I'll give you was the most recent stock market crash. The first stock market crash in the history of the world in which human beings didn't make the foul-ups. No, they had their... You can't buy and sell on the stock exchange now because human beings don't make the decisions fast enough. You have computers geared to make the rational decision programs work. The stock market crashed because of the computers making individually rational decisions based on their little bit of information. All working together crashed the market. And it would have crashed further except that we still are able to unplug them. How much longer they will give us that privilege is part of the debate that we'll engage in the next part of the lectures. We still have the privilege of unplugging them. I think it will, you know, it's a reasonable conjecture when the decision will work the other way. They will say, to heck with you, we'll unplug you. No, this is why, and I mean, you need an answer to this question. Why did the Enlightenment, which began with the love for something that I too love, human reason, and with its use to demystify things, how did it itself become a force of mystification? Well, here's another way it did. I've talked about how it debunked religion, but it engaged in overkill. By debunking religion in the way in which it did, it left us open and said science had nothing to do with whole fields of human experience which are now just given over to the wildest kind of insane theories. For example, if you look around now, there's never been a period in the history of the world where more people believe more completely nutty things. I mean, just watch a current affair. Elvis is still alive. UFOs landed in Alabama. Anyway, UFOs, poltergeists. See, you couldn't even list all the myths in a year. Why? Well, because science marked off this terrain of reason, but outside it, it pays no attention. It gives no guidance. Why are there things outside of instrumental reason at all? That's the theme of the whole course. The self under siege could never find meaning in this denuded form of thinking and living, where all that you're up to is making rational decisions one after another. That's not a rich enough notion of experience or human life. So what we have is, on the one hand, this sort of Enlightenment instrumental reason that is for sure necessary for the sciences and so on. And on the other, the ways in which people today try to get meaning are just incredibly bizarre. Incredibly bizarre. I mean, I'll be moving shortly out to California, where I think they have a new religion a week, a Religion of the Week club, drive-through religions. They worship crystals, and I've talked about these other forms of pseudo-pagan body worship. We've got lots of mythic religions. The Enlightenment, in other words, carried myth right along with it. It did not kill it. And it may be that this entwinement of enlightenment and mythology is what is most important to understand about the situation that we're in now. By that I mean in the late 20th century, because now our technologies are themselves quasi-mythological. Virtual reality. You know, you have a movie about virtual reality. A guy gets in a suit and enters a world of neural networks and goes, "I am God here." You know, this is pretty pagan stuff, except for one small thing. They can build these things. You know, otherwise we'd be laughing about it, except they can build them. Now let me give you a classic one that even analytic philosophers know about. It's in game theory. That's something that analytic philosophers love, game theory. It's beautiful. It's called the paradox of the downs. Here is the game. You have 2 sheep herders, and each of them have 100 sheep. And there are downs out there enough to feed 100 sheep. One sheep herder on this side of the game and the other on this side, and they get to start simultaneously. What is the maximally rational policy to follow? Well, the maximally rational policy, according to game theory, is to drive your sheep onto the downs as fast as possible and have them start grazing. The trouble is that when you both do that, you don't lose 100 sheep. You lose 200. It's a lose-lose game. That's the problem. There you've got 2 mutually rational actors doing the mutually rational thing, and the outcome is irrational. Now, I've gone through this at some length because this is going to be the heart of a criticism of modern technological society that Marcuse will raise. This is at the heart of his criticism. It is not his criticism that our society should just throw away instrumental reason, should just give up on thinking scientifically. That's not it at all. It's that if we don't find a more balanced approach to ourselves, the world, other people, than instrumental rationality, we are lost. So let me run through just a little bit of his basic argument. If you wanted to break it down into so-called worlds, you'd start this way. The inner world we've already discussed, that inner space of the self that Descartes thought he knew all about. Well, we've already discussed the pathologies that arise in the inner self through its contact with what you might call modern life. And of course, you do that when you study Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche too, but you also do it, we also did it earlier when we discussed Heidegger and Sartre. The inner world is noted, or at least it was, because as we move on into the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st, it'll be a real question about whether these inner structures are still intact, because they have both a positive and a negative valence or significance. The inner structures are anxiety, forlornness, nausea, dread, despair, anxiety, and so on. Those are inner structures. Now, again, we have a massive psychology industry to deal with this, and then we, of course, have a society that is massively soaked in drugs. I mean, I don't know how long American society would hold together if it was not a society of addicts. When you think of the leading drugs, and all of them are like either Valium or Prozac, you know, and then look at the drugs the kids take, look at ghetto drugs, look at the normal and official drugs, which are very powerful, like alcohol and cigarettes. The truth of the matter is Marx was wrong. Religion is not the opium of the people. Today, opium is the opium of the people. It works better. I mean, opium works better as opium than religion did. So that's the inner world. And while it cannot be, none of these substances can cure the sicknesses of the self under siege in the late 20th century, but we know what all these things can do. We know it from drinking. They can dull it. They can make you forget it for a while. I mean, my mother was a beautician for years and years, and still is, occasionally. And she drank a lot, and it was not, she really wasn't a drunk. It's just that when you work 12 hours a day, your inner self feels better, numbed a bit. So these are not accidental. Again, these are not personal or accidental things. They're quite widespread and social. A writer about whom you might be interested, who I think, even though he's a little crazy, is a good novelist about the society being a society of addicts, is William Burroughs. Naked Lunch is a very strange book, but it has at least one thing going for it, and that's that it shows us as a society of addicts, which I think is not entirely unfair. I mean, that's to me is what's silly about the war on drugs. The war on drugs must be just a war on a certain group of people doing it in the wrong way and with too many guns. Because, I mean, sit there and look at the pharmacy and what's going out of it, and I don't know that many people that aren't stoned on something. A handful. And they're what are they doing? Well, they're out eating soybeans and jogging, which I consider even sicker. I mean, if you're doing that, you really need help. I mean, that's when you need to be put on drugs, is when you're out there on, you know, jogging and eating soybeans. You need the damn drugs. Okay, that's the inner world, and for the existentialists, this was what they focused on, was some of these inner world problems. In the so-called social world, the problems are, and I'll lay them out, and I'll use some of the Marxist terms, alienation. Now, alienation in the Marxist sense is a kind of feeling of separation that is not just a mere mood, it's a structure. It's a separation from your object that you're producing, if it is an object, and nowadays in our economy it's probably not an object. You're probably not doing a damn thing. So then you'd be alienated from nothing. But let's say you're producing a product. It's separation from that product, lack of control over the process of making that product, lack of meaning in making it, and separation from other human beings that come along with that. In short, what Marx means by alienation is the way the relationship between work and money separates human beings from each other, which to me is true, and Jesus knew it, and most people that know much about money know it. It's true. It doesn't mean communism's true, it just means that stuff about money is right. Rationalization. This is a big word. I'll try to demystify quickly for you. Rationalization. There's a great social theorist you could read here. That's Max Weber. Tells a lot about how the more complex governmental and private enterprises get, the more they need to bureaucratize and rationalize. But if you really wanted a sense for it, I would tell you, don't read Max Weber, read Franz Kafka. Because when you read The Trial or The Castle, you get a real sense for what a bureaucracy feels like. For a world rationalized and the outcome being irrational. See, no one likes bureaucracy either. I mean, you know how it feels. You go, your income tax return didn't come, so you've got to go get one. They say, well, go to room 107. And you just left room 100, and you show up in room 107, and they say, well, you didn't pick up Form B in room 100. Who did you talk to? Well, you don't know them personally. You're not asking them, did you talk to me? Do you know who I am? Do you know who you talked to? I mean, you get that on the phone from IT, the The telephone company will go, what operator did you speak with? And I go, ma'am, I'm not personally acquainted with all of them. I don't know who the hell I talk to. But no, this is the Kafkaesque quality of life as we emerge into the 21st century. Yeah, it's an adventure to get your water hooked up. It's an adventure with madness like this, with utter madness. And we're here, very close to Washington, D.C., where I don't need to explain this at all. Anyway, there's rationalization, and I want you to know both of these come along with modern life. And again, if you don't like these arguments that I'm drawing from Marcuse, look at Charlie Chaplin movies, look at Modern Times, and notice how when it was made, people could still laugh at the way Chaplin's motions matched the motions of the times, because people could remember they didn't always move like that. Now we'll rent Modern Times and we'll look at it and go, boy, I wish we moved slow like that now. Because, I mean, now it looks real slow. He's just going with the machine. He's not having to run with all these flows of data or anything. He caught a break and didn't know it. Anyway, that's rationalization. And then the third, and this is sort of one of my own, if you'll forgive me, is what I'll call banalization. And it's always a danger when you do lectures like the ones I'm doing now. And that's to take these fundamentally important things, like what does my life mean, and surely there must be a better way to organize the world than the way it's organized now. Surely my life could have more meaning in a different situation. Maybe my life's meaning might be to change it or whatever. But to take any one of these criticisms and treat them as banalities. This is the great, to me, ideological function of television and the movies. However extreme the situation, TV can find a way to turn it into a banality. The real question I'm asking here is the one Marcuse asked in the 60s. How does a way of life break down? How does it break down? And Marcuse doesn't give the pat Marxist answer, which means economically. And we ought to be glad that that pat Marxist answer is false. Because if a society could be driven to ruin by debt, the way a lot of people said the Russians, the Soviet Union fell because it was broke. Let's hope that's not true. Since we're broke, let's hope that's false. As a generalization, we better hope it's false. How do they break down? Well, here there's an analogy for me between the social and the self under siege. In many ways. In many ways, not in a few. And some of the symptoms that we see around us that our own lives are breaking down in the life of our society is a generalized cynicism and skepticism about everything. I don't know how to characterize this situation. I find it no parallel to it in human history. The skepticism and cynicism about everything is so general, and I think it's partly due to this thing I've called banalization, and it's partly due to the refusal and the fear of dealing with complexity. Much easier to be a cynic than to deal with complexity. Better to say everything is bullshit than to try to look into enough things to know where you are. Better to say everything is just silly or pointless than to try to look into systems of this kind of complexity, into situations of the kind of complexity and ambiguity that we have to deal with now. So anyway, that's one way in which a society can break down. My own view of the United States government is that it has no legitimacy now in the classical political sense. That means it is not supported by a democratic majority of its people. It has no classic political legitimacy. I mean, I take that to be an empirical fact. I bet you could probably do a factoid on CNN about it and banalize it. You go, oh, well, big deal, so what? Well, so what? You don't have a damn democracy. You've been lied to since you were born. Well, that's no problem. We're used to it. That's cynical reason at work. I mean, it's just utterly the situation that I think we're finding ourselves in. This skepticism includes the skepticism concerning history and this has not been a diatribe up here against reason. It's been a diatribe against instrumental reason. Clearly, the uses of a more comprehensive reason to try to figure out where we are would be important and could be used, but there's a general cynicism about it. Marcuse is an old-fashioned guy from the 60s. He still thinks, and I have no way to defend him now. Too much has happened. Too many things have gone wrong. But Marcuse still thinks that human beings as a species have historically accumulated potential. Over history, they've accumulated a potential to live a life with a good deal more freedom, and a good deal more happiness and solidarity than the one they live now. In fact, Marcuse, unlike philosophers, is an unashamed advocate for this project. Philosophers don't enjoy being advocates for any positions that matter, usually, but Marcuse is, in this case, an advocate for this position. Now, that's the method within which Marcuse criticizes even capitalist society. Not with external norms drawn from some utopian situation, but by its own terms, with its own terms. I also think that that's not only a good strategy as a style of critique, but it's utterly fair. I mean, in a way, it's like demanding of yourself that you do what you say, you know, which you want to demand at least of your friends, that they do most of the time what they say they'll do. But it's certainly a good demand to place upon your society, its leaders, and so on. The trouble is that just as I've stated before, we are blocked. We're blocked in a way by an unprecedented structure of what I have called here sort of cynical, skeptical reason. It is just, to me, it's historically unmatched. I've never read or heard of a period like this one, and I've read about many historical periods, but not one in which you can talk to young people the way you can at the college level today and find out that they believe nothing, want nothing, hope nothing, expect nothing, dream nothing, desire nothing. Push them far enough and they'll say, yeah, I got to get a job. Spend a lot of money at Duke. That's not what I'm talking about here. They hope nothing, expect nothing, dream nothing, desire nothing. And it is a fair question to ask whether a society that produces this reaction in its young is worthy of existence at all. It really is. It's worth asking that, whether it's worth being here at all. And my criticism of this society couldn't get more bitter than it is in that case. It couldn't possibly be. Remember, I'm talking about the young I've encountered at Duke. These are privileged youth at an elite Southern school, mostly white, mostly upper middle class to upper class. Now, imagine what the attitudes are like in the streets of D.C. if you're from another race or another social class. We have outlived in the 20th century the responses that Marcuse would have given to this. I still admire, in his book, The Argument Concerning Enlightenment, I still admire his vicious attack on bureaucracy, both here and in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and his attack on a world in which money comes before human beings. That, to me, is the sort of one-line essence of the critique of Marx. I mean, of Marx's critique, where money is placed ahead of human needs, where just money is placed ahead of them. Marcuse still tries to defend, as I say, freedom, happiness, creativity. He still believes in the truth. He still believes the human race has a happy destiny. I mean, I think that we have to look back at Marcuse, who at the time we looked at as a vicious radical. I think we have to look back at him as a kind of Norman Vincent Peale of the 60s. Marcuse wasn't radical at all by the standards of this world into which we have slipped by the late 20th century. No, he really does sound like Norman Vincent Peale at times. It's almost quaint if it wasn't so horrifying. Because his meditation and his, not meditation, his theory and his view is about the destiny of the human race on this planet, about whether we will ever learn to make sense or whether we'll just keep making money and madness. It's a real big question. He never was able to answer it, but one of the reasons I wanted to raise it right in the middle of the lectures is I didn't want these lectures to turn into some kind of funky kind of Tony Roberts course in self-development. Like, now I know who I really am kind of crap. Because when we're through, we won't know. I don't know. If I'd known who I was, I probably wouldn't have shown up. Now, I mean, you know, this is not, I mean, it's an important part, and it's not a cynical thing to say, but it's an important part of finding out about the self in this part of history, that we don't have all the answers, that we have not even formulated all the questions correctly. In fact, Tony Roberts and people like him are a part of the problem themselves, their banalization. I love it when I hear someone say, I've listened to Tony's tapes, and now I used to be fat and unhappy, and now I'm skinny and happy. It just makes me want to cut someone up with a chainsaw. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, no, you know, that's not why humans think. They think because they have to think. It's a felt necessity. It's the weight of the world, the complexity of it. And you can avoid it, I admit, with drugs, but at some point in your life you have to come across the need to think. Marcuse comes from a period, and it's back in style, in fashion. I have to admit it, the 60s are back in style. Everyone, they probably will be out of style by the time these tapes are out, but people are back listening to Jimi Hendrix, wearing bell-bottoms and tie-dyes. I suppose you've noticed that. Of course, this would have nothing to do with banalization. Well, of course it would. Because anything that's a threat to this system can be banalized. It is obviously a form of control. It's social control I'm talking about here. It's not a conspiracy. I mean, it's just something that happens in the process of a society working out its own internal logics in systems of incredible complexity. Banalization is a way to reduce complexity. It's also a systematic way to be an idiot. And I have to say this, many of our complaints about the educational system fall under the critique of Marcuse as well, where we produce student after student in this condition I've described, which is not really despair because it's beneath that level. In other words, they'd have to be more excited to be in despair. They'd have to be like more thrilled to be forlorn. Like they'd have to be in love with something before they could have their heart broken, to make a more simple example out of it. No, it's beneath that level. It's frighteningly beneath it. It cannot be defended. Herbert Marcuse, while he lived, made these arguments, and as I say, looking back on them from this point in history, from this point in time, it's hard not to feel a little nostalgic for them. But I have a feeling that they'll come back, along with tie-dyes, Jimi Hendrix, and who knows. They may even have someone like me tour and denounce the system as the warm-up act for a rock and roll band. I mean, who the hell knows? In this lecture, I want to discuss one of the most important philosophers who's still working, still alive. His work ranges over many areas in social theory. It ranges in areas of philosophy, linguistics, and so on. And that's Jürgen Habermas. Habermas is one of the last great defenders of rationalism in a period in philosophy in which rationalism is not held in very high esteem. In many ways, Habermas is an outgrowth of one of the figures that we discussed last time, namely Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. That would include Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Habermas was, in fact, Adorno's graduate assistant. And so the original project that Jürgen Habermas set himself was to reformulate the kinds of theories being worked on by Marcuse, by Horkheimer, and by Adorno. In particular, his first venture was to reformulate their distinction between traditional theory, understood as both philosophy and science, both, as opposed to what they called critical theory, a theory whose interest was in the emancipation of human beings. Now, this may sound a little sort of fancy Dan. The whole attempt was a way to attempt to reformulate Marxism in a setting appropriate for the late 20th century. So this is a very important school of thinkers, of which Habermas is, in a way, the last and leading exponent. It's clear, I mean, especially in his later work, that he's moved a considerable distance away from Marxism. That would be obvious, I think, for almost any thinker in the late 20th century. What I want to do is to start and move you through in 45 minutes from Marcuse's rather exuberant radicalism, his youthful radicalism. I want to move from there through Habermas's attempt to reformulate that project while keeping in mind our central theme, which is the self under siege. I mean, what was important to Marcuse about social systems was not what would be important to the average economist, which was, you know, maximizing utilities. What was important to Marcuse about economies and other things was their effect on the lives of selves. How did they cause the self to be able to construct itself? In other words, how was the economic and cultural impact of that lived out in human beings? And I discussed a whole series of pathologies of both the period in which he wrote and that pathologies that have continued down to the present day. So that was Marcuse's interest, was in liberating people from that unnecessary part of life suffering. Not death, you know, I mean, I think we, you know, again, I don't think we can get around that. But there's a vast difference between living to be 90 and being well-educated and fed and relatively healthy, and dying at the age of 3 weeks in Biafra with flies in your eyes. There's a significant difference there, a difference that people have found worth fighting over and worth dying for. So Habermas attempts to reformulate this project. He begins with a distinction that's central throughout his early work between labor and what he initially called interaction, but which I think can safely be called by now communication. And his argument was a fundamental argument. He said, if you look at the human species, it has fundamental human interests. One is to reproduce its life through labor. In other words, through work. That's a fundamental interest of the human species. You don't do that one, and sort of nothing else gets off the ground. It's a fundamental human interest. Habermas locates a second fundamental human interest, and this one is different, quite different for him, in communication. In other words, in the interest that human beings have, and it's a deeply seated interest, in communicating with one another. If you think about this, it would be required for everything from any kind of social bonding, without which even human life in the anthropological sense wouldn't be possible, and so on. It's a fundamental interest, not just in communication, this is important, but in undistorted and clear communication. That's our fundamental human interest. Because we have a fundamental human interest in undistorted communication, we need to understand what Habermas calls systematically distorted communication. And I will be on to that in just a minute. First, I want to briefly lay aside the part of the older critical theory and of Marx that Habermas leaves alone as he reformulates his project. The labor half of the distinction is pretty much left over to the standard economic accounts that grow out of his tradition in the early Habermas. Labor is understood as a kind of monological or instrumental endeavor. In other words, it's an instrumental endeavor driven by the imperatives of efficiency and so on. It's an instrumental endeavor, and he defines it as being monological. He also says about it something that's sort of banally true. He calls it a productive endeavor. It's the endeavors surrounding production as opposed to those surrounding communication. Communication is, according to Habermas, by its very nature, dialogic, okay? And what Habermas wants to locate, because he knows that there are traditional disciplines throughout the history of Western or Indo-Western, Indo-European societies and Western civilization that deal with problems both in the area of labor and communication. So I say in the area of labor and instrumental reason, we have the sciences, and in the area of communication, we have the humanities, which are supposed to enlighten us about dialogue, tell us more about how to talk to one another. For Habermas, we really form ourselves as selves in both dimensions. But we could not, for Habermas, possibly become subjects, selves, without the communicative dimension of dialogue. So he would utterly reject a sort of empiricist account like David Hume would give, or like Skinner in a more modern period would give, that we could become human simply by looking at patches of blue and listening to pieces of phonetic sounds. Because for him, we become selves in much the way we do for Mead, the great American sociologist. We become selves in our interaction with other selves. In other words, it's by seeing how other people respond to the things that we say that we cue in on who we are. We may adjust it and so on. I mean, this seems to me, at one level, an obvious point. I mean, this seems to me obvious, but you'd be surprised it's not obvious in philosophy. Now, the most controversial part of the early Habermas's work is his claim that the human race has a third interest. And of course, his whole argument will hinge on this. And that's the critical interest in emancipation. That the human race really has an interest that's fundamental. By that he means an interest that's so important that we need it in order to survive. To free ourselves from both the distortions of instrumental reason and the distortions of what could be called, and will later in his work be called, communicative reason. We need to free ourselves from these distortions. In other words, for the human race to survive, we need to learn to labor more humanely to the extent that we can manage that. And we all, in the focus of his early work, perhaps more important still, we need to be able to communicate with one another freely and clearly, and that without doing so, our chances of a long survival are not great. So throughout this work, you can see in a way that we have first a reformulation of a kind of Marxian side of the account of human beings in Habermas's labor part of the distinction. Now, for his communication model, we have what I would call a hermeneutic base for it. By hermeneutic here, again, I mean interpretive. And the philosopher he discusses, Dilthey and others, where he says the great art of the humanities, if you will, the way they further communication, is through the interpretation of texts. And I'll be talking a lot today about the interpretation of texts. Because in the humanities, when you get right down to it, that's what we do. Let me say it in a simple West Texas way. We read books. We read books. We tell our students what they mean. You know, this is what we do for a living. And so don't let hermeneutics throw you because it's a big word. It means interpretation of texts. Now, don't think that this is some fancy Dan academic exercise. A lot of people have died because they read a book the wrong way. I want you to think of the history of the world's great religions. One could write a book called The History of Heresies and retitle it The History of Misreadings That Led to Death. Now, I don't mean to be cynical, it's just obvious that reading a book and interpreting a certain way can get you in a lot of trouble. Similarly, those familiar with the law know that just any reading of the Constitution won't work. I mean, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, except if Rick decides, if I decide I want to start a religion of my own that includes, slaughtering innocent babies with oyster knives, in which case my reading of the Constitution will lead me into deep trouble. I can support my reading. I mean, the Constitution says no law. It must mean that. I'll be literal about it the way that some people are about the Bible. I'll go, no law means no law. So whatever my religion, be it baby slicing or whatever. But I'm afraid that won't be considered a reasonable reading. In fact, I'm sure of it, and don't think that I'm suggesting it as a possible religion to any of you out there in the world of video. I'm not. So this is the field of interpretation. But this is not enough for Habermas to have this field of instrumental reason within which science and technology and human labor advance the world technologically. And this field of interpretation where humanity advances itself through conversations in an ethical and in an aesthetic way. There's a third human interest, and this is, of course, crucial to his argument, because like Marcuse and Adorno and Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and all the people that I've discussed, Sartre, he has a fundamental interest in human liberation, the liberation from unnecessary constraints to our freedom and to our full development. So he wants to show where that interest lies and where does it come from. Well, he looks around and he can find only one model, and it's unsurprisingly Freud, because in a way, when you reformulate these things, you always sort of seem to fall back on the earlier models in one way or another, updated, jazzed up in some way. So the model he uses for distorted communication, that corresponds to what Marx called ideology. Those remarks that we make that reflect the interests of classes other than the ones we belong to. Those remarks that we make that are shaped by that truism of Marx, to me, which is that in every age, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling classes. That, to me, is just a truism. It's not even a theory. And I think any fair reading of philosophy will bear it out. In every age, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling classes. And if you read the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, it has independent interest. But basically, it's a handbook on how good Athenian gentlemen should be good Athenian gentlemen. I mean, that still's interesting, because people today would probably be better off behaving that way. But what the hell, it still shows the ruling interest and so on. Now, according to Habermas, what replaces ideology in his model is what he calls systematically distorted communication. He doesn't give many examples. This is a really bad habit German philosophers have, is to make complex arguments and then not give you a damn example one, so you're just lost wondering what is he talking about. Well, I think he has in mind blocks between communication that, for example, you're having a trade union meeting. Let's use Solidarity for an example. That ought to tickle people in America, even though if we had an organization like Solidarity in America, it wouldn't tickle us. But since it's over in Poland, I think we can praise it. You know, trade unions, one of the funniest things I ever remember is Reagan praising Solidarity, and then I thought, well, I wonder how he'd like a trade union that large in this country with those kind of demands. I don't think he would have been praising it. But in any case, let's talk about a dialogue among them. And it doesn't have to be otherworldly. It could be the kind of dialogue you could have among any trade unionists. Well, you know, it's a right-to-work state, so we don't have a chance. Well, for Habermas, this falls under the model he wants of systematically distorted communication, because it's sort of a flat statement. It cuts off debate. you know, and debate needs to go on. Moreover, it passes that famous test of ideology, and that's when you ask yourself if what you believe is in the interest of other people for you to believe it. In other words, I always suspect a belief if I hold it, and I go, well, you know, the very powerful would love for me to believe that. Maybe I should rethink it because I don't know exactly where all my ideas come from. I have an idea many of them come from the people who control the means and the dissemination of information and communication. Okay, so he looks for a model where systematically distorted communication is overcome, and he finds it in Freud's practice of symptoms, of removing symptoms in the situation between an analyst and a patient. And in that situation, what you get is not an interpretation. In other words, the patient doesn't say something and then Freud interpret it, right? The patient just babbles on and on and on and on and on. This is not a normal interpretive situation. There are a couple of differences. Unlike trying to read a text, it's a situation where the goal is practical. In other words, it's to cure the person, to make them stop having the symptom. So it's got a practical goal. Interpretation frequently will not. Another difference that is very important for Habermas is that Freud succeeded to a certain extent in developing a practice that did remove blocks to communication. Okay, you have your patient babbling away, sort of the talking cure style of revolution is what we've got going here. You have your patient babbling away, and the only way you can bring this analysis to a conclusion is when the therapist intervenes, presents a possible interpretation, but it will not work until what happens? Both parties agree to it. In other words, it won't be your analysis until you go, yeah, I keep biting people because, and then you go, and when you and the therapist agree, you have then all the sort of confirmation that your previous behavior and our communication was distorted. It was distorted. Now, that's the model he wants to work with, and he thinks we have an interest in removing these distortions to communication so that we can have what Sidney Greenstreet calls in the Maltese Falcon, clear speaking and plain understanding. This is a good. This is something civilization needs. Well, this forces him to another level of argument, of course, because if what you want to remove as opposed to ideologies, or if what you want to counter are ideologies, if instead of that you've reconstructed this as systematically distorted communication, the next question someone may ask you is this: what in the devil would undistorted communication look like? In other words, now you need some kind of account of communication undistorted. The reason is that our communication is nearly always distorted. Have you ever noticed that? Take a transcription of any conversation and you'll notice there are gaps in it, misspoken words, misunderstandings. The materiality of language is filled with these anomalies and with these mistakes. And I even have to say, along the Freudian dimension, certain sexual jokes and so on, many sort of what you would call distortions of communication appear along other dimensions besides just the dimension that would reflect on human labor, for example. Many other dimensions you get distortions as well. Habermas here, and this is a bold thing for him to do, I want to point this out, in the late 20th century, after all I told you that was going wrong, and after what looked like the destruction of reason itself in just, you know, in a society of subjects that have become kind of humanoids, it is quite a valiant thing to try to defend human reason, you know, in any form. And he does try to do so in this limited form. He wants to mark off a sphere of undistorted communication that can serve as the basis for a concept of what he calls communicative rationality. Now, before we get into that argument, I want to explain why he does that, other than what I've already said, other than the reasons internal to his early work. He wants to do it to untangle the entwinement I talked about last time between enlightened thought and barbaric action that we've seen since the history of modernity. In other words, we've seen on the one hand people making these individually monological instrumental decisions based on instrumental reason, leading to these horrible paradoxes. And for Habermas, the trick is not to give up on modern life. It's not to fall beneath the level of civilization reached by capitalism. The trick is to disentangle enlightenment from terror, mythology, and barbarism. That, clearly, we haven't succeeded in doing in the 20th century. That's why I spent a lot of time in the first 4 lectures discussing, or sometime discussing, the experience of fascism and its effect on the earlier thinkers we talked about. Because fascism was the proof that enlightenment and technology had not led to the liberation of human beings as the great philosophers of the Enlightenment thought it would. Instead, it had led to Dachau, and this was not its destination. This was not what the destination that had been hoped for it. You know, the 19th century believed in progress. Adorno once cynically remarked, there is no history that leads from slavery to freedom, but there is a history that leads from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. So what Habermas wants to do is to try to find a way to disentangle the more distorting, barbaric aspects of enlightenment from those that we clearly want to hang on to. In Habermas's opinion, there have been advances in modern life, and I don't think anybody would dispute this. The advances in modern life include one this simple. It is much better to have a toothache in 1993 than in 1493. That's simple. Whenever anyone asks me about this, I go, well, there's one. In 1493, a toothache, if it's bad, impacted, it's the end of your theoretical work. It may be the end of your life. You get one now, you go to a dentist. That's better. Not everything that modernity has produced has been a disaster, obviously. I mean, this is an obvious point. So the trick then is, as it were, to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, not throw out the advances of modernity when we are in the process of trying to clear up this distorted communication forms and these distortions to people's ways of life. Okay, that's the trick. So there's a lot riding on his argument concerning systematically distorted communication. Well, Habermas holds, and this is the rationalist thesis, this is the Enlightenment part, that the sentences that we utter, even from an early age, have, as it were, built into them the desire for consensus, for mutual understanding. That whether you consciously bring it to mind or not, when you speak a sentence, it has built into it, if you're following my argument, built into it the desire that you be understood by others. In other words, it has the critical impulse already built into it. That impulse that you communicate with that other person if they're from a different class, if they're from a different gender. I mean, this is difficult. Men and women talking, different class, different race, different ethnic group. When you utter a sentence, Habermas says built into that utterance, into that communication, as one of its conditions is the desire for unconstrained understanding. Now, you don't, when you say, pass me the salt, bring to mind a desire for universal unconstrained understanding. But he thinks it is built into the structure of languages, the desire to understand one another, the desire to have clear communication. He begins to lay out a series of conditions which time will force me to just run through very quickly for such communication. One, and this of course is what I like to call the equality provision. Understarted communication would have a symmetry condition. Truly understarted communication would have a symmetry condition like this. Everyone would have an equal opportunity to talk and to listen. Everyone would have an equal opportunity to talk and to listen. Let me try to explain why this is more politically interesting than it sounds. It means everyone has an equal right to command as to obey. That's a speech act. That's a communicative act. It means everyone has an equal right to question and to an answer. This symmetry condition has more political power than it seems at first. It is a very egalitarian principle. Habermas believes that we couldn't have understarted communication without it. Now I'll give, again, he doesn't, but I'll try to give examples to make it understandable. I know as a teacher that it's an important condition, but it's impossible to achieve in a classroom under these current social conditions, because I have the power to grade a child and give him an F and keep him out of law school, even if his rich daddy sends me 500 letters. Because I have that power, I can't expect that student and I to communicate in an understarted way, because our communication is distorted by my power to judge what the student says. This is why the people who run operations, bosses, seldom get the understarted truth about their situation. I also think, being a husband, that it's why husbands seldom get the truth about the relationship they have with their wives, their sons, their daughters, and so on. Because when you're in a relative position of power, the other person's aware of it too, and of their role, and you cannot expect an understarted communication, one not. And I, again, don't mean personally, but systematically distorted. This is systematically distorted. It's distorted by relations of unequal power. If you're to be communicatively rational, everyone has to have the same right to speak and be heard. I also need to give you a real-world example of that. And that would be something like the great early meetings of solidarity. I mean, Lech Walesa recognized people, but anybody could stick their hand up, union member or not. That was when they had crossed the line into a total revolution. And Lech Walesa, sure, he was recognizing people, but everyone had a right to do that. And it wasn't always him either, even though that was what was presented in our media. And that is, while not perfect, and we're not expecting the world ever to be perfect, neither is Habermas, this is a model of communication that is what you would call dialogic. You're dialoguing now, you're not monologuing. You may notice that this is based on a quite ancient idea. It's a Socratic ideal. When Socrates argues with an interlocutor, he never pulls the argument that, well, I'm more powerful than you, so you're wrong. As a matter of fact, one of the charms of Socrates is that he owns almost nothing and has almost no position. And the only force he expects you to recognize is the force that Habermas says is the only force a free human being can ever recognize. And that is that peculiar, strange, unforced force of the better argument. Habermas believes that much in rationality, that we can change our minds if we hear a better argument. And a free person can do that without being ashamed of himself or herself. You know, if you're in a free and equal situation of communication and someone convinces you through a better argument, you go, well, I now believe differently, but not through distortion or anything, but through just that strange force that a person feels when they become convinced. They go, oh, gee, now I agree with that. That is the force that a free human can recognize according to Habermas. Okay, another condition, and these are obvious conditions that arise, I mean obvious, each one can be disputed, and I will discuss philosophers later today who dispute everything I'm saying now. But I want to present Habermas's, since this is one of my main areas, I want to present his position as powerfully as I can. Habermas also thinks that in various dimensions we try to communicate in certain ways. For example, while we do occasionally lie, it belongs to Habermas to the structure of, say, instrumental reason in the sciences, that when we contribute to a discussion on that topic about what's in the world, what entities there are and how they behave, that we try to make our contribution to the conversation one that is true. Now, this is the sort of linguistic reformulation of a Kantian postulate. But no, I mean, in a way, it's a piece of good advice. I mean, if I was to say, how should you talk? Well, try to be relevant. There's a relevancy conditional, built into speech. This is how, this Habermas gets some of this from Grice, and I'm adding a little as I go along. Make your contribution to the conversation relevant. So if you're at Lech Walesa's trade union meeting, don't start discussing Harrison Ford's latest performance compared to Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's not relevant. So try to be relevant, true. Try to make your contribution one that is true. Doesn't mean you will, but try to make one that's true. Another condition built into this, what Habermas has now begun to call the ideal speech situation. The ideal speech situation. Well, why ideal? Well, because he realizes this is an idealization, that human beings won't be able to fully carry this out. But to the extent that we can, we will be engaging in communicative reason. Try to be relevant, try to make your contribution one that's true, and C, and this is obvious to me too, try to make your contribution one that's sincere. When I think about that, I always think about an article written in philosophy that is a brilliant article that would be praised by all my colleagues, but it ended with the sentence, "Oh, by the way, I'm only joking." In a way, that one sentence would undo the whole article. I mean, it would be like, no matter how good the article, someone would go, "Well, what a joke! I mean, this guy's a..." No, the idea here is that when you contribute to what's called a reason conversation, that humans expect the contribution to be a sincere contribution. And let's see, the final one is a moral condition. And that's that we expect that you try to make your contributions to language ones that advance the cause of what is right. Now, there's no theory here of right other than the ones that you've just heard in the communication theory itself. It would be wrong to be insincere. It would be wrong to, lie. It would be wrong to violate the symmetry condition. It would be wrong, and so on. In fact, this is a quite thin moral theory, but come to think of it, when we tell our children, look, you ought to do this, what stands behind our ought is something implicit in language. Namely, that our children can depend on us, sincerely telling them a moral truth. This is what, earlier when I said we don't learn moral theories from philosophers, I didn't mean in this sense Habermas is talking about, because we do learn it in this sense. Habermas means that when mothers tell their children or fathers, don't lie, they mean it. It's not distorted. They mean don't lie, or don't whatever. This is the ethical, as it were, dimension of language. Now, he doesn't want us to confuse these various spheres. They all interplay in language. But for Habermas, and this is a tradition that goes back to Kant, these each represent different practical areas. Science, morality, art, and even religion all represent different value spheres. Each one will have certain conditions that will be much more important in it than in others. In the scientific sphere, truth conditions will be most important. In the ethical sphere, the conditions for what we ought to call rightness, or how one ought to behave, will be most important. In the aesthetic sphere, Sincerity conditions, Habermas says, are important, mainly because he wants everything to fit. I'm not sure that's true about beauty or not. I'm not sure we want the beautiful to also, our communication about it maybe shouldn't even be sincere. But these things need to fit. This is a German theory that needs to fit. Okay. Well, it looks like we've replaced Marx now by ignoring the economy, which wouldn't please any of the coal miners in West Virginia. Tried to replace it as a way of understanding ourselves in the world. And we have traded in the class struggle, which Marx took to be the driving force of history, for Freud's talking cure. Well, there's some obvious criticisms raised by young Turks like myself in the early phase of his work, namely that the class struggle is not psychoanalysis writ large. The reason it's not is because workers have every reason to believe that their bosses are not prepared to engage in a process of undistorted communication with them. Now, a patient may believe about his analyst or her analyst that they're prepared to, especially at those rates. As Freud once said, if you don't pay, you don't get better. But I mean, at those rates, you can expect some sincerity and some give and take, but we have no reason to believe the class struggle is a kind of psychoanalysis writ large, or that the struggle of human beings over ethnicity, or of the struggle of women to find dignity and equality is some kind of analytic process writ large. Habermas is aware of these objections and responds to them in several ways. The one that bothers him the most is the following, that his model is elitist, his model of communicative reason, which I have counterposed to all these pathologies to which it is addressed. When I mentioned all those pathologies that the young people I know have, and, anomie, in other words, meaninglessness, and anxiety, dread, so on, you mentioned all of those. Well, those are all systematic distortions of communication that come out in the way they talk and interact, and the theory is addressed at those. But here's the problem. It's not just that this doesn't reconstruct Marxism, which is of little interest if it's not a true and interesting theory of the present age. The deeper problem is that it looks like an elitist theory. It looks like a theory that trades Marx's analysis of society as a giant factory for an analysis by Habermas of society as a giant seminar room. Have you noticed how all these conditions are the ones that ought to hold in a seminar? Everybody in a seminar should be relevant, concise, sincere, and make their contributions true. And it's not lost on any of Habermas's critics that he's spent his whole adult life as a professor. So this is, now, I don't want to just stomp on him with one of these West Texas ad hominem arguments here. Habermas responds in a way quite movingly to this objection. He says, you have missed the point, because what I'm talking about in communicative rationality is a process of enlightenment that includes all. Janitors, cooks, everybody includes us. It includes everyone, so we've missed its universality. But more importantly, and I think this is a beautiful quotation from Habermas, he says, in a process of enlightenment, there can only be participants. No analyst and patient. So in that way, the model was misleading originally. No Lech Walesa and the lead. No Clinton and the Clintonians. No Ross Perot and United We Stand America. In a true process of enlightenment, there can only be participants. Now, that, stated that way, Habermas's communication theory looks like a linguistic variant of anarchism, and I like it, because it means that everybody gets a chance to talk. I enjoy that. So now, let me, in the time remaining to me here, let me move a little further along to how he's reformulated the theory, and he's had to under the force of various objections. And they've come from all kinds of people. I gave you the Marxist style objections, but But hermeneutic, or interpretive people in the humanities, didn't like his account of the humanities as limited either. In other words, they didn't like that account as it limited to a single interest, because they pointed out something that's come up in here several times, and that's that the sciences are also interpretive. And they went, look, the work of interpretation isn't just for us humanists, but everybody interprets. I mean, it was Galileo that said that the world was like this giant text and mathematics was its language. Well, the analogy of the world as a text is one that's very familiar to scientists. To read, as it were, and interpret is not something that's limited to books alone. Interpretation, in fact, may be one of the fundamental conditions for selfhood. One of the problems in the current situation with what I have called previously information overload and complexity may be the difficulty that gives us in interpreting everyday life situations. Because everyone, whether they know it or not, is always already an interpreter. When you stop at a stop sign, you've interpreted something already. Now, you've done that without too much interpretive work. Red, in our country, means not only commie, it also means stop. You know, I mean, red means commie to me, means commie, anarchist, hippie type scum, but it also, when it's a light, means stop. Acts of interpretation go on constantly, all around us, in all forms of conversation. There's, as it were, in our encounter with the world itself, we see some smoke down the road. We have to interpret, is it a wreck? Do I need to go another way? People who've lived together a long time and think they know each other well are still constant interpreters. My wife will see a certain look on my face, and it's interpreted, and I don't think correctly, but she just goes, and then we're off on something, you know? But I mean, this shows the ubiquity of interpretation in human life. I mean, in a certain way, one of the characteristics of what the self is, and one of the reasons it's under siege, is we're interpretive beings. And now, by the late 20th century, we're in a situation where interpretation has never been more difficult. Never been more difficult. I can name artifacts that we've developed technologically that are almost completely closed to interpretation, and I'll name one, although we attempt to interpret it. Television. Television tries to interpret itself to us, bypassing the upper brain functions and directly feeding into our minds. This is why I said off camera between classes that Orwell was a pie-eyed optimist. 1984 arrived in sort of the early 70s, and Orwell's vision of a horrible future, which was a boot stomping on a human face forever, is a utopian image because he assumed there would be resistance and human faces, both of which may turn out to be false. So, I mean, 1984 is not a book that scares me anymore. I mean, it's again, I know that last time I outrageously said that Herbert Marcuse was the Norman Vincent Peale of the 60s. And now this time I've been forced to say that Orwell was an optimist, you know, a sort of my corollary to his little cautionary tale. Well, in the face of all this, I think that the tribute I want to pay to Habermas, and what interested me about Habermas's work, was to try to defend reason in spite of all of these things that I've said. You may notice that I gave an account of cynical reason, but I didn't give you an account of how I might stand vis-a-vis it, and I've said a lot of cynical things. Well, what I admire in Habermas is the attempt, without being a complete idiot, to try to develop an account of reason that runs against cynical reason. It does say to us, we can speak to one another. We can have processes of enlightenment. We can learn to say what is true to one another. Now, it is true that this is endangered in ways that he didn't discuss in his early work, which he does in his later. His later work, especially a very large book called Theories of Communicative Action, Habermas once again returns to the attempt of defending this idea of communicative reason, and he adds many more problems to it. First, he recognizes something that I've already pointed out, which I think he always recognized, but he again, in typically German intellectual fashion, he needed time to write a 4,000-page book on it. In my book, when I gave an account of his book, I did it in 31 pages, and people said, well, that's too short, and I went, no, his is too long. But he realizes by the time of his mature work that money and power as abstract systems to start our everyday life in the ways we talk, and that those systems will have to be, as it were, harmonized before we'll be in a position within which it will really be possible to speak to one another face to face. And I hate to be quasi-theological, but perhaps if we could do that, then we wouldn't see through a glass darkly. You know, maybe then we would have a way to find our way out of this dilemma, which I have called this terrible entwinement of enlightenment and terror, barbarism, and myth. And if nothing else, Habermas's project offers us one powerful voice that argues that such a possibility exists. And so for that, if nothing else, I think he deserves a lot of credit. Thank you very much. That's Habermas in a nutshell, very short. Thank you. In our last lecture, we discussed Habermas, and I think that we left out at least one thing I need to begin with before I proceed with Foucault. And that's Habermas's view of the self as a thoroughly social being that is the interaction of the natural world, the social world, and the inner world of human, as it were, suffering, sympathy, subject entwined in desire. Those are the three dimensions to subjectivity that Habermas discusses, and he sees each one as challenged in the late 20th century. And so I wanted to add that to maintain our subject under siege theme. Habermas's account that I've just finished is, as it were, one of the more optimistic accounts, if you will use a word that simple. It's one of the more optimistic accounts. But it still does not relieve the subject of the incredible pressure to construct meaning and conditions for communication under conditions that are very unfavorable for that to occur. I mean, that's still a part of his account. We will now move on to a thinker who, in at least a couple of respects, is like Habermas, and that is a magnificent, it's hard to characterize him as a philosopher, and no one knows exactly where to put his books. We don't know whether he's a historian, a philosopher, a sociologist. In fact, that's almost the mark of late 20th century thinkers. It certainly is the case with Habermas that we don't know where to stack his books, and similarly with Foucault. They move across disciplines, and I think that's very important. So that is one thing they share in common. It's difficult to know the disciplines they're in. Another thing they share in common is an interest in emancipation. In other words, we're again talking about, in this case, not as in the case of Habermas, a left liberal style thinker, to use an American phrase here. We're talking about a very radical thinker whose politics, like the politics of Noam Chomsky, who the last time I checked was an American, like Noam Chomsky's politics. This is a person who is what I would call a principled anarchist. Now he has a difference though. He does not, in a way, have his politics intervene in his writing nearly as much. In his writings, what he tries to do is to develop a fundamental critique of what I might call our dominant ideologies, which are sort of centrist. A little liberal this and a little conservative that. But he tries to develop a powerful critique of what you might call the dominant paradigm within which we do our politics, within which we run our educational institutions, within which we operate our prison systems, within which we operate various psychiatric disciplines, and so on. And he does this in a different way. Unlike Habermas, whose account is very abstract, if you noticed, Foucault enters his topics through the avenue of what might be called histories, but they cannot be understood as history in the traditional use of that word. And so I'll start by giving a brief account of some of the jarring things about Foucault. One is that Foucault is infamously known for holding the view that there are no facts apart from interpretations. So for Foucault, there are no bare facts in history. In other words, there aren't just little facts you run across separate from the interpretations within which the facts are embedded. So this makes history look like a kind of battleground. In other words, you've got your story and I've got mine. As a matter of actual historical practice, when you read historians, I don't think this is a bad description of the way they actually work. I don't know why certain neoconservatives like William Bennett find this to be relativism, when I see it as just a good description of the way historians actually practice their craft. And it's not a simple-minded thing like everyone has an axe to grind. It's not like you don't get surprised, even based on your own interpretation. And it's also not the case that as you work through your interpretation, you do not change it radically and change your mind and your prejudices. In fact, when you do that, that's when you are doing your best work, usually. So I don't see this as outrageous as many other people do. Now, the word history itself is avoided by Foucault because he thinks that the word history within Western civilization is necessarily a kind of continuous narrative about progress. So Foucault prefers to the term history terms like archaeologies and genealogies. You may notice that this is some of the influence of Nietzsche on Foucault. Nietzsche wrote a wonderful history of moral life as it had arisen in the West, but he didn't call it a history, he called it a genealogy. So what is the difference between genealogies and histories? And at least these following conditions are ones I've been able to pick out in Foucault's work. One of the methods that's different in a genealogy and a history is what might be called the reversal of perspective. Now this is one he takes from some of the better historical work in the tradition of Marxism. And that's where, and I mean Marx is famous for this, but so are some people that you should know about like E.P. Thompson, who wrote The Making of the English Working Class, and C.L.R. James, a wonderful Caribbean intellectual who wrote The Black Jacobins. This is reversal of perspective, is where you don't write history from the standpoint of Henry Kissinger, but from the standpoint of the masses of humans that do the masses of things that they do in order to produce large and significant movements that change formations, social formations. And this is really to take sort of a reversal of perspective. You take what, in a way, is left out of the official histories and use that as your clue to write a history of suspicion that something's been left out. A history like that of the American Revolution would be fascinating, and I know at least one person, Larry Goodwin at Duke, who's working on such a project. Well, anyway, reversal seems to be a method of genealogy. Another is one connected to it, and that's marginality. You don't just pay attention to what the leaders said, or the men said, or whoever the dominant group is. You look for the marginal discourses that do two things. They both make clear that there was a marginal discourse, and they also show more clearly what the assumptions of the dominant history or discourse was. So marginality is another feature of what might be called a genealogy or archaeological method. And the third one seems to me just a very practical principle. It's a principle of discontinuity. And that means write your history without the assumption that history is continuous, without the assumption that it will end up being a rational story, without the assumption that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but rather accept history in what is called its materiality. You know, in other words, along with all of its contingencies, its moments of luck, the strange and bizarre things that happen. I mean, even Marx does this when he writes the history of the rise of capitalism. It just turns out to be fortuitous that gold is found in the New World, which then can be sent back to Europe to build merchant capital. Well, if over here they had found cow chips only or buffalo chips, then that contingency would have affected history. And that seems to me to just be not something that could have been predicted by a rational narrative. They happened to find gold, you know. So don't assume that there will be, as it were, a telos. And this is deeply embedded. Telos means goal. I mean, it's, or purpose. And this is deeply embedded in the way that Westerners think, because I think in a way because of narratives like the Odyssey, where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Narratives in particular like the biblical narrative, where you have an absolute original beginning, you have a redemptive middle, and then, you know, a final and glorious end. And this mode of thinking has affected historians for years. Foucault does his best to, as it were, try to bracket or to stop those assumptions from interfering with the way he wants to write history. Or I should say, the way he wants to construct his genealogies. Okay, now, here's the claim, I think, that is the most outrageous of Foucault's, and about which a lot of the debate that you hear today about deconstruction, even though Foucault is not a deconstruction person, a lot of the debate you hear today about the universities hinges on this important claim by Foucault, and I'll start with it, and I will defend it. And then I'll give you an example of a powerful work in which he makes use of this claim. The claim is as follows. Knowledge is controlled in every society through mechanisms of power. Anywhere you find knowledge, there also you will find power. They're linked. They are conditions for the possibility of one another. Knowledge is a regime of powers, the way he sometimes says it. Today, in using the distinction I've used in these lectures, I might want to replace the word knowledge with information. And it wouldn't hurt Foucault's argument if I did, given that I think that's what the university systems and other systems produce. That's a better term now for it. But in any case, the idea here is that it cuts deeply against a lot of our humanistic sentiments. We would like to believe, based on the long Platonic tradition, that knowledge is what can be accepted by all rational beings. And the standard model for that in philosophy is mathematics. You know, 1 + 1 is 2, and you don't vote on it, and it doesn't matter what you think. And you know, that's probably right about 1 + 1 is 2. But it's a far different matter about whether it's right about the structure within which we learn systems like mathematics. And that's what Foucault is concerned with, or whole genealogical slices of time within which we learn certain practices and how to obey them. Now, when I have my students argue with me about this thesis that where you find knowledge or information, there you also find power, if they keep arguing with me, I threaten to give them a C, and then they agree with me. And that is what I call a demonstration by direction. Or a West Texas phrase for it would be hitting a mule upside the head to get his attention. That will get a student's attention when they realize that your power is connected to your knowledge and vice versa. By the way, if they happen to be the son or daughter of a $3 or $4 million donor to Duke, then their power is connected to how their knowledge may have to be treated by someone. Although I generally ignored that kind of thing. In fact, I always ignored it. All right, now that's the thesis that's considered, as hard as it may be to believe, because I think I presented it in a commonsensical way. This is the thesis that seems to have outraged a whole group of people at universities, as though this doesn't speak to the experience of, and of course it does. This is why they associate it with political correctness, because this has always spoke to the experience of those who've just entered such systems. Women, when they first came to the university, African Americans, Chicanos, and so on, have always experienced the knowledge that they were to receive as a form of power. And this certainly was true of the working class kids that entered the university system in the 60s. You know, as I said, thanks to a lot of student loans that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for, which I'll give him credit for, since his friend John Connolly recently kicked off. In any case, this has seemed to me to be obvious, but it's caused a furor, you know, a real ruckus. It's as though someone has sort of given away the secret. I mean, I don't think there are that many people in serious, quiet conversation that don't recognize this relationship, but it's not one that we like to talk about publicly. And that's that even a graduate student we have in physics that we take a particular dislike to, and who comes up with equations and views about Newtonian dynamics that are, say, at odds with various more contemporary views relating to chaos theory, we can call him a old-fashioned and kick him out. Or if the reverse is the case, we can say he's a kook and his work is too flighty and too bizarre and kick him out. I mean, clearly there's a relation, it seems to me, between knowledge and power. It is a mechanism that has operated, I think, in every society. The issue is whether there is any way, and this is going to be the happy issue, will be whether there's a way to uncouple knowledge and power. I'll leave that aside for a moment as I move through this thesis. Knowledge is comprised of not only institutions, and I'll be naming them later, of institutional rules and so on, but of discourses. And this is where we get back to Habermas in relating to communication. Knowledge or information is comprised of discourses, communications, that function through rules of exclusion, not inclusion, through rules of exclusion. In other words, institutional communications function through rules that determine who may speak, about what they may speak, for how long they may speak, in what setting they may speak, and so on. And again, this is not an invidious thing. All societies have had these. You may notice, if you watch the Congress, that there are rules for how long people may speak. There are rules for who may speak. If you're a freshman member, it's not advisable to try to hog a lot of the clock. This is not an advisable thing to do. And I don't want to make it appear as invidious in every case. But also we need to see these rules of exclusion as leaving out of what some sort of liberal theorists like Richard Rorty call, and I mean, I can't believe that they ever called it this. Richard Rorty once described philosophy as the conversation of mankind, borrowing a phrase from Michael Oakeshott. Well, that's very nice, except certain people didn't get to talk in the history of Western civilization. They were excluded from the conversation. The deviant were excluded. And I'm naming some now that have been studied by Foucault. Deviants, criminals, the mad, and of course the more normal exclusions. Up until very recently, women, the young, the old, the infirm, so on, excluded in a certain way from this conversation. And I'm not afraid to say, along with Marx, that we really don't notice many working class or lower class people in the early great literature of the West. In all the works of Homer, only one common foot soldier appears, and he has one line. Basically, he says to Nestor, the wise old general, the plan, basically sucks, and then he walks out of the book, and that's it. Of course, it does, and so it's kind of a little joke. I think Homer was aware that certain people weren't getting to talk. So when we talk about Athenian democracy, we need to remember that just like early American democracy, it excluded a lot of people. In fact, according to Foucault, the exclusions were a condition for the possibility of that being a form of knowledge and discourse. In other words, it wasn't, as it were, by accident that these groups were picked out. They were picked out because their marginal discourses would allow the main discourse to be even more in place, in control, and so on. And this seems to me, at least, to cut very strongly against Habermas's communication theory. Because if it is the case that wherever we find information, communication, and so on, we have power that controls the ways in which it flows, who may talk when and how long, if there's no way to uncouple that, then Habermas's argument will fail. Foucault does not say it will fail. In fact, Foucault himself, because he holds a radical anarchist position, is caught in what I would call the critic's paradox. The more powerfully the critic paints the ills of the society and the fragility of the self and the struggle it undergoes to be a human, the more powerful our account is, the more hopeless the people feel who could do anything about it. On the other hand, if we don't paint the account in such a powerful way, then people tend to underestimate what they're up against. So you've got a critic's dilemma. Foucault clearly has picked the path where he doesn't care if you feel powerless or not. That's your problem. You've got to do something about it. So he draws out all the mechanisms of control to the maximum so that you understand them. Okay, he wrote a series of books. I'm going to use one as an example of his thesis that knowledge and power are intertwined and the effects it has. And I will pick one of his most famous, but let me quickly give you a set of the books that he worked on. He wrote a book called Madness and Civilization, in which he pointed out the long history of how the discourse of reason had excluded from it the mad. Now, this history changes, as you know. In the medieval period, the mad are considered the way they are. How do the mad appear in Shakespeare's plays? The fools, the mad. Well, they appear as the people who bring the most important wisdom into the plays. The mad in Greek society were considered as touched by the gods, and their words were looked at almost as the words of oracles. But with the increasing, as it were, with the increasing rationalization, a word I've used a lot, and a word I used yesterday, rationalization of the world, the mad began to be shut away in asylums. At first, this was a brutal process, and later it became humanized. This is a word that Foucault does not like. In fact, he doesn't like humanism or the talk about humans. He's afraid every time he hears it that it is not a word of inclusion, but of exclusion, based on the history of the use of that word. I think African Americans can particularly relate to that, since only within the lifetime of a couple of generations have they become more than 3/5 human. They can understand what it means for it to be a term of exclusion. In any case, the great reformers of madness, the ones who wanted, as it were, to cure them, created what Foucault calls a whole new disciplinary matrix around madness. What that means is that the curing of them did not liberate them, it did not give them the value that they had at one time. No, it set up a whole series of processes within which they could be observed, drugged, analyzed, reanalyzed, And of course, I've joked about this process. I don't want to use the strong word madness here, but when we look at the expansion of this therapeutic zone on into the late 20th century, we now find out that very few of us don't belong in it. I mean, if you're not on a 12-step program today, you're out of fashion. I mean, who would have guessed that the discourse of madness would eventually cover the whole social field, and until perhaps the last growth industry we have, other than making movies about sex and violence, is psychiatry and running 12-step programs. This is a growth industry. This is one industry where you can, you know, retrain yourself in midlife, since you don't need a degree to do this, actually, and set up a 12-step program. So for Foucault, this is not some great new humanistic advance in medicine that has liberalized the treatment of madness. It is a new form of control that's based on a new language about the mad. For example, we no longer call them morons and idiots. We call them the differently abled, and so on. But for Foucault, this new discourse is even more totalitarian, because behind it hides the same mechanisms of power, or not the same, but behind it hides mechanisms of power which keep these people in their sway. See, for Foucault, this is why it's not humanism. This kind of malady is a cultural malady that strikes at the very heart of life. So the book I've decided to use is his famous work, and I'll show it to you and suggest that you all read it, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And I intend to go through the argument in some detail, because it would be very much against the spirit of Foucault to give you all the abstractions about his position, but not give you the really important points where he works out in detail how these interlocking systems of knowledge and power actually function in his genealogies. That's the real meat of the story for him. So I'm going to go through this in some detail, at least the detail that the constraints of time allow me. Discipline and Punish begins with a very short chapter called The Body of the Condemned. And this is in the period, I think 17th, 18th century period. The king is at this period in the history basically takes place in France, but similar practices were also taking place in England and in other of the countries that were on their way from merchant capital to an advancing capitalism. But still, this is pre-revolutionary France, so you still have a king, and France is run by the red and the black, you know, the red of the church and the black of the army. That's a famous novel by Stendhal, for you people who still read novels, The Red and the Black. It's worth reading. But in any case, The Body of the Condemned begins with a famous and hideous passage, which if I read, then this tape will probably be censored. And it's about the way they killed people who committed horrible crimes. Now today, when people commit horrible crimes, they're on a current affair for 3 or 4 nights, right? 2 or 3 books are written about them. They make a movie about them like Silence of the Lambs, and then they're locked away somewhere. That's where we're moving. That's where we move to. But let's start from how we got there. The prisoner that he begins by discussing is drawn and quartered and torn apart by horses. I'll make this brief. Lava is or sulfur is poured into his wounds and set on fire. I don't need to go into detail here. You understand these medieval tortures. They're well known. The condemned man must, as it were, the priest comes up, and the condemned man must make his honorable announcement before God that he understands the justice of the punishment. And of course, after the punishment's begun, this is not a hard thing to get him to do. And so the book begins with him kissing the cross and making his honorable amends, would be an English way to say it. And then they continue to torture him, and and literally on his body is written the power of the king and the church. other words, it's literally written on his body. By the way, if you want for me to suggest another literary way to look backward at that form of punishment, remember The Penal Colony by Franz Kafka, where the machine writes literally on the body of the victims. Of course, Kafka has lived to see modernity, so the machine ends up eating its own judge, writing on the judge, "Be just," which I find among Kafka's many hilarious stories. I mean, I find them funny. I'm sorry, I'm that sick, but I find that another funny one. In any case, it starts with the body of the condemned. And the next chapter is about the spectacle of the scaffold and all of the ritual that goes along with these kind of ceremonies. When they're going to do this, you can imagine the streets of Paris. They're all abuzz. There's the spectacle, the scaffold. There are vendors. There are people that write little pamphlets about the executed. I mean, we have an American analogy to that. That's like, you know, the little Billy the Kid pamphlets that were printed up in the early West about our great criminals and so on. Foucault asked this very interesting question. What was it that fueled the interest in the criminal? Why was the criminal the star of this production, the scaffold, the spectacle of the scaffold? He's the star. Well, the crowds became unruly because in many cases the courage of the criminal would become the legend of the spectacle. The courage, the tenacity, and the bravery of the criminal would become the story. Well, reformers decided that this was not a healthy mode of punishment. Foucault cynically decides that perhaps it was not considered healthy because the wrong people were the stars of the show, not because it was too barbaric. And I think that that's not only a cynical guess, but he gives some evidence that that's the case. In any event, we know that this early history of punishment, from the Middle Ages at least, from the early sort of pre-capitalist days, this interest in criminals has continued on into the present. I mean, they still haven't found a way to discipline and punish that have totally drained us of our interest in criminals. As you know from watching any television, even if you hate it, you've got to know this. I mean, I think that Time Life now is going to put out a series of books, I'm not denouncing them for it, on criminals. But this is nothing new, right? These are things that excite us as the normal because they break up the regime of normalcy and show it in a way for what it is. In other words, just as when the king wrote his punishment on the body of the condemned, the mute body of the prisoner, even if he said nothing, spoke volumes about the institutional rules that would put that practice in place. Well, anyway, that practice was abandoned. It's been a while since we've drawn and quartered anyone, although when you listen to some of the latest rhetoric about law and order, I don't know how much longer it will be before we'll be drawing and quartering people again. But anyway, that practice for at least the present has been abandoned. And it's replaced, according to Foucault, by what he calls generalized punishment. It's very interesting. The French word might lead us to believe that this is a sort of double word. It's not only punishment, it's potential punishment, and it's also a kind of, the word discipline would be a kind of surveillance. So what happens is that the change, if you wanted to look at it, what Foucault is writing in this book is a history of criminology in a certain way. The change here is that we move from the body of the condemned as a singular individual, Billy the Kid, you know, to use the American example, to a generalized social body. Criminals now appear not with names, but as public enemy number one. I mean, anybody could be that. You know, in other words, it's a general abstract role. It's across the whole of what could be called the social body. And in fact, we now see punishment, and of course, I want to make this just as cynical as it is. It's the great reformers that are responsible for this. This is the work of the liberals. I mean, the conservatives wanted to continue to draw and quarter people, but no, let's reform. The great utilitarians like Bentham, which I'll mention, whom I shall mention again later, were among the reformers that led the way in some of these areas. When punishment becomes generalized across the social body, across the whole of society, what happens is that punishment becomes something like public works. You know, you do a small crime and you go out and you do works for the public. But like sweeping up can't be as heroic as having the king's name written on your body. In fact, it's rather degrading. It's not supposed to be something about which one can write a dime novel. Prisons become more like schools and less like these festivals of atonement. They become places where people are to be re-normalized, injected back into the social body if possible. What the reformers have done, according to Foucault, however, is not to abolish power in favor of more humanistic treatment. What they have done is to institute a microphysics of power that has control over what Foucault calls docile bodies. Power has lost its awesome grandeur, its splendor. The power now in institutions like prisons is a micro power. It's the power of observation, of being able to control movements, of being able to force prisoners into get-well programs and lie to their parole boards after having lied to therapists, after having lied to all the various people they have to lie to in order to get out. And for people who think that prisoners are being let out right and left, watch a little court TV and see how many people actually win parole. Now, in some states where they've stopped building prisons because they are tired of tax and spend, some prisoners do get out, but by and large, it's hard to get through a parole board. What this parole board represents to Foucault is a kind of training, a kind of disciplining of the body so that it no longer has to be written on in these grand, spectacular letters, but in which the prisoner himself accepts being a docile member of the social body, who goes to prison and simply accepts as a fait accompli the very rules of this humanistic institution. Let me give you an example, and again, this is not exactly a prison, but this is a great example, and I hope you've seen the movie. I like using examples from movies. And if not, there's a great novel by the same name before the movie, and that's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, written by Ken Kesey. The movie stars Jack Nicholson. There is a great reformer in the movie. She's a wonderful woman, and she's there to help the patients. It's Nurse Ratched. Nurse Ratched just demands docile bodies. Randall Patrick McMurphy's doom is that he cannot become a docile body. He's an anarchist. He's doomed. He's excluded. He's excluded, but not really. Actually, he's helped. I mean, you know, the lobotomy calms him down. It makes him normal, docile, like most of us. Of course, if you've seen the film or read the book, you may begin to understand what Foucault is driving at. If McMurphy had been born 200 years ago, he would have lived the grand destiny that maybe Billy the Kid did. Billy the Kid being probably in real life a psychotic teenager. It's probably the sad story about him is that I'm sure the Eastern writers way overdid it, but then that's part of crime, isn't it? I mean, this fascination with it has not ceased simply because power has reconfigured it. Okay, that's one example. But I don't want to leave it with that example at all. because we get in the great reformers some clues as to what they're up to that are magnificent. And some of them relate to architecture, and that's very important if you were to understand the point Foucault is driving at, which is not simply about prisons, although prisons and criminology are the focus of his study. He's trying to point out that we have a society that is an entire carceral body, a social prison, within which each one of us have certain safe walks and certain excluded walks. And all of them are surveilled, and our behavior is surveilled. You know this. You've walked in malls, and the dummies now, you know, the clothing dummies, frequently have these little cameras for eyes so that they watch you while you shop. I mean, this is... I don't want them watching me when I'm so overweight. When I'm trying on a new pair of pants, I don't want to have some anonymous person in the booth watching me try on my new pants. But surveillance isn't like that, and I have not yet achieved the status of docile body myself. But anyway, let me bring in Bentham again. Jeremy Bentham was not only one of the great utilitarians about whom you will hear in a course of the great minds, he was also an architect. And he has some drawings of a building called the Panopticon, which, as he says, could function as a prison, but also could be made to function as a university or a school or a hospital, because it has this odd feature. It's sort of a circular building within which the administrators can see down through every cell, but all the people in the various cells of the institution can see is at most the person across from them, and usually not that. It is not the building itself that I'm so interested in, just like Foucault says, I'm not interested in the building itself, but the principle. The panoptic principle, what he calls panopticism. It is a hierarchical principle that allows the gaze to be directed unilaterally. I like to call it the CIA feeling, even though I think that the CIA is now largely obsolete. It's the CIA feeling. It's that they're looking at me, but how do I know when I'm looking at them? That's panopticism, and this is not just a feature of prisons. This is what Foucault points out. In fact, it's hilarious. Many of the same architects that built our prisons in North Carolina and elsewhere also built our what? Our schools, our hospitals, all of the places in which we want to keep, contain, and control docile bodies, docile social bodies. For this reason, Foucault extends as a generalized critique of our society that it is in fact a prison. It is a carceral gulag. I mean, that's strong talk. That's strong talk. There's no prison and no medieval torture that brings to mind this sort of slow death of the soul by degrees that a docile body suffers as it walks through all these routine and laid out paths of life, being constantly observed. And the current fascination with criminals, I view in the context of Foucault's work, it's not that current. I mean, in the 30s they loved gangster movies too, but this fascination with criminals is the compensation the media culture pays to us because of our secret attraction to crime, not because of our fear of it. The attraction of crime is the attraction of someone who says, hell no, I won't play that way anymore. And I admit that at one level we're afraid of criminals. We don't want to be hurt. People don't want to be hurt. I'm not arguing that. The argument's at a whole other level of institutional rules and expectations. In our society, in the United States, these rules include many rules of ethnicity that they wouldn't include in other societies, although there they have their own ethnic problems. No, it is that there are walkways through an institution like Duke where certain kinds of people are expected to move docilely and others are not. These are the exclusions that I'm talking about. You find this in malls. It used to be that a mall was just a damn place to go to shop. Now, not everybody can get in the mall. You know, if you're wearing a big baggy sweater and you've got an X hat, you may not be able to get in the mall. Not that I want in one. I'm a person who suffers from mall fever. Mall fever may be the last symptom preceding the death of what Foucault would call the docile body. Well, anyway, thank you very much, and that's as far as we could get with Foucault. Thank you.